Well, now for the other point of view, let me welcome onto the stage Michael Baum, Professor Emeritus of Surgery and Visiting Professor of Medical Humanities at University College, who will argue that screening for breast cancer does more harm than it does good.
Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, lovely to be here. Something I want to say, which I hadn't prepared to say before. Tony Howell and I are very close friends. We've hung out together for 30 years. What you're witnessing today is polite scientific disputation. And it's something I'm very, very proud of amongst scientists, that you can have two scientists of complete integrity disagreeing, apparently in an extreme way. And yet, we talk against each other and then go off and have a beer together. And that is the beauty of scientific discourse, which we don't see in politics, which is, at the moment, quite hateful. Now, I have to start off describing my conflicts of interest. Well, first of all, I want to show you a picture of my family. That's me when I was 11. And that's my mother Mary that Katie mentioned. She died of metastatic breast cancer in uncontrolled pain. And I was so angry about the method of her dying, the way of her dying, that I somewhat was influenced about my future career. This is my little sister, Linda, who became aware of a lump in the breast, I think when she was 45 or 46, and had lumpectomy, radiotherapy, and 5 years of tamoxifen. And 25 years later, raise your hand, she's well. I have 2 daughters and multiple nieces. My family is Ashkenazi. We are a family at high risk. So my main conflict of interest is that I am on the side of women, not industry. I'm on the side of women. So that's my first conflict of interest. The second conflict of interest results from the implementation of the Forest Report in 1987. There's the report, and that's Sir Patrick Forrest. That was published in 1987. I was then Professor of Surgery at King's College Hospital, and I was given the task, along with our Professor of Radiation Oncology, Radiology, Diagnostic Radiology, to set up the first screening unit. There were 3 initial national screening units. I had to do that, and I was proud of what we achieved. This was opened on time, on budget in 1988. And from there, we trained a whole cohort of specialists. I have a conflict of interest, and I always wanted screening to work. So there are my 2 conflicts of interest. One thing about the screening process I somewhat objected to was the coercion that women were subjected to in order to maintain the target figure. We have to have 70% compliance. Otherwise, it won't work. So there's no issues of consent. It was coercion. And amongst the items of coercion was this kind of leaflet designed for women with learning difficulties, 50 or over breast screening for you. And frankly, I found that repulsive. Why do we screen for cancer? That's a rhetorical question which I addressed to my students, and I always got the answer, to catch it early, sir. And I would say, wrong. Catching it early has no biological meaning, as you will understand in a moment or two. We screen for breast cancer in the hope of prolonging life or improving quality of life. The only outcome measures of meaning in medicine, quality of life and length of life. Now, the hypothetical model driving this idea is described here. it's considered a linear dynamic, and that you have a direction of growth. You start off with duct carcinoma in situ, and after a period of time it becomes a small node-negative breast cancer. After a further period of time, it becomes a node-positive breast cancer and disseminates. Now that's the conceptual model around which the structure of breast cancer screening is built. And it's very important to realize there is a mathematical conceptual model of the disease upon which this structure is based. And again, I will explain in a little bit what that means. So the idea is catch it early, save a life. And by catching it early, what you really mean is you hope that by detecting DCIS or detecting very small breast cancers, you will later avoid deaths from breast cancer. That is a very simple model of the disease. And here I like to quote one of my favorite people, H.L. Mencken. For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And that applies to so much that we do in our lives. Well, let's see if I can challenge the received wisdom. I was appointed to the National Screening Committee in 1988, and I served for 10 years. I resigned when evidence began to appear that the benefits were exaggerated and the harms were ignored. And I insisted that we share this information with the women invited for screening. And I was told if we did that, we wouldn't keep our targets at 70%. And I said, so be it. And then I found I was in a minority of one in a committee of 12. So I resigned on principle, on the basis that I believed in treating women as grown-up, mature people who can understand complex issues better than you, the committee of men, can understand these complex issues. Well, eventually, as Tony Howe mentioned, there was so much debate and so much concern about screening failing to live up to its promise that we had the Marmot report in 2012. And this was of great interest to the media. And here's the top people's paper, the Times, and their conclusion was keep having scans despite the downsides. And they did something which annoyed me for a serious newspaper. They had anecdotes. 3 women who claimed their lives were saved by screening. Well, maybe there were, but there is no way of identifying the individual woman who did have their life saved by screening. I hope there are some. I hope there are some in the audience, but there is no way of knowing that. Now, this is what the bottom paper had to say. To screen or not to screen. And you may notice that that was written by me. I really lowered myself to write for the Daily Mail, and I apologise. But, okay, you want an anecdote? I had an anecdote. Here's a woman who felt herself railroaded into screening and was not happy with the outcome. But rhetoric aside, what are the numbers? Well, the estimate of benefit for screening was, at the time of the Forest report, a 25% relative risk reduction in breast cancer deaths. That was at the time of launch. Then, within a short time of each other, there were 2 other major reviews of the data that were being updated. This is my concerns, that the benefits were set to be 15%, not 25%. And ultimately, to split the difference, the Marmot report came up with 20%, as Tony Howe said. Now, I'm going to say something that may surprise you. I think there are only 2 people, or maybe 3 people in this audience who knows what a 20% relative risk reduction is. It's a complex mathematical construct. I can work it through and explain it to you, but individually it means nothing to the layperson. So to invite a woman to say, come for screening, there's a 20% relative risk reduction of breast cancer mortality, is not an informed choice. Now, these estimates, as Tony said, have gone from one extreme to the other extreme. He mentioned a figure 1 in 200 lives saved. 200 women, 1 life saved. I frankly think that's absurd, and I cannot even work out how they derive that number without accepting that the most optimistic estimates were made for calculating that number. Now, here's another chart. Nothing to do with me. It's called the Risk Literacy Group, which is an international group who are trying to distill numbers down to a decision aid for the benefit of women. And here we have an illustration of a 20% reduction in breast cancer mortality from screening in 1,000 women. Now, it's a difficult chart to follow. You may not be able to see it in this light. But on the top, black spots, these little dots are a woman. And there are 1,000 women on one side who were screened and 1,000 women on the other side who were not screened. And the 1,000 women who were not screened had 5 deaths from breast cancer over a 10-year period. The ones who were screened had 4 deaths from breast cancer over a 10-year period. 5 to 4 is a 20% relative risk reduction. No one here could be able to calculate that without seeing this risk assessment. So here we are taking a fairly optimistic look at absolute benefits, and the difference is 4 breast cancer deaths versus 5 breast cancer deaths. That's the 20% reduction. But the interesting thing, if you look at all the data, not just breast cancer, and you look at all the data in all the overview analysis, including the Cochrane report, deaths from cancer were identical. So the red dots are deaths from breast cancer, any cancer. So deaths from any cancer are the same. Now, you look at the other dots. These are the harms of screening, which were not included in the report. All the green dots are the women who've had false alarms on screening, were called back for further investigations and biopsies, and the little blue dots are what's called overdiagnosis. I will elaborate on that at a moment, but what it means is finding something that looks like a breast cancer under a microscope, yet is not programmed to progress and threaten a woman's life, and at the same time is treated as if it was a threat to the woman's life. Let's go back to the mathematical model. If that is true, then frame shifting it to the left, the more DCIS you diagnose, the fewer cases of early breast cancer would appear. Michael, you're familiar with these data. Michael Dweck and I did a very, very interesting study 10 years into the screening program, looking at the incidence of different cancers and the incidence of mastectomy and lumpectomy in the screened population in London. Now, this shows the incidence in different age groups. These are the age groups not screened, the under 50s, the over 64s. And there's a gradual increase over 10 years in the diagnosis of DCIS. That is DCIS. And I was at the sharp end. I was one of the few people on the committee that were doing the screening and doing the surgery. And I became aware of this immediately. I thought, great, we're detecting all these early breast cancers. We expect that all the more advanced breast cancers would disappear. That was our initial hypothesis. Well, let's look at the diagnosis of invasive cancers. Again, the unscreened groups, under 50 and over 64, more or less static. And to our dismay, we found there was also an increase in the incidence of early invasive breast cancer. And we couldn't believe this. We were so concerned that we thought we'd made mathematical errors and delayed publishing it. Meanwhile, this 2 or 3 years later, it was all over the medical press. And here is an example, I hope you can see that, from America, looking at the American experience between 1975 and 2017, showing the incidence of DCIS rising as we expected, but also an increasing incidence of early stage. So there's something fundamentally wrong. Detecting DCIS does not reduce the incidence of early invasive breast cancers. So there has to be something wrong in the mathematical model. Now, I must emphasize, it's not me saying this, and these are not new data. This paper comes from the British Medical Journal in 2005, nothing to do with me, another group. And I want you to look at these lines here. In the screened population, the incidence of cancer, the unscreened group, the incidence of breast cancer. Huge increase in the incidence of breast cancer in the screened group. And here we see mortality from breast cancer. And you can see the screened population is doing a little better than the unscreened as far as breast cancer mortality is concerned. But you look at these lines, death from any cancer, death from all causes, they are superimposed. And we know this from many sources. And again, come back to this, a lot of these problems, there'll be plenty of time for discussion at the end of the talk. You won't be forgotten. You can be first on the list. So come back to the issue of overdiagnosis and the consequence of this, the perils of overdiagnosis. And they are too much surgery, too much radiotherapy. This was another slide from the work we did together, Michael Dweck and I, and as the incidence of DCIS increases, the incidence of mastectomy increases. And the meta-analysis of all the screens show that any population where the screening starts, the mastectomy rate goes up. Now that seems absolutely implausible. How can that be? Well, that's because many cases of DCIS are multifocal. And if you've got foci all over the breast, it's very difficult not to do a mastectomy. So the woman comes to screening, has DCIS, she's told, oh, you're lucky, it's very early. Comes to me and I said, I'm sorry, I've got to do a mastectomy. It's terrible for surgeons like myself to be faced with that, because we don't know which one of these foci is the one that may or may not take off. So that's one hazard. The other hazard is the risk of radiotherapy. Radiotherapy is not a benign treatment, and there is a significant increase in the risk of ischemic heart disease from radiotherapy. And here's just one of many papers showing the increased rate of major coronary events according to dose of radiotherapy at the time of treatment. And they're modest numbers, but they are real. And then the other risk is lung cancer. And again, another slide showing the blue line. These are the smokers, incidentally. If you're a smoker and you have radiotherapy to the breast, there's a very big increase in deaths from ischemic heart disease. If you're a non-smoker, it's there, little, but it's real. So although these toxic effects of treatment are acceptable against the lethality of the worst kinds of breast cancer, if your cancer is not programmed to progress, then you're having treatment for which there are no benefits and only harms. Now, I published a paper in the British Medical Journal a few years ago trying to use all estimates of benefits, all estimates of harms, and come up with a trade-off. And because the benefits in avoiding deaths from breast cancer are fairly modest, and the toxicity of overtreatment is fairly modest, they seem to cancel each other out. And so I thought, in good faith, based on all the data available, that it was a close call. And coming back, you can see this described through the Risk Literacy International Group. Not me. Okay. You're going to say, I'm sorry, but I still don't understand why catching it early doesn't save lives. I sympathise. It's very difficult. It's easy to explain why screening should be good for you. To explain why it's not good for you is difficult. Demands lateral thinking. Right. Complex systems. We understand complex systems. You see this every night, the weather forecast. Forecasting the weather is forecasting the outcome of a complex system, the weather. We now know how to do it, and we get pretty good. And I am arguing that breast cancer is a complex system within a complex system. That breast cancer does not grow in a linear way, a convenient linear way, so you catch it early and save a life. Now, to explain what complex systems mean, it's easy to explain. Here's a complex system, there's Piccadilly Circus, and there are all the roads leading out from Piccadilly Circus. It's a very complex system, because those roads will have varying amounts of traffic lights, cops, and as we've learned through our course this morning, work on the road, digging up holes in the road. So if you had a perfectly good car, it would be difficult. You have to use ways to navigate your way to here from home. But the system we're navigating is a complex system. Is there petrol in the car? Is it a fast car or a slow car? And is it maintained? And does it obey the traffic lights? Well, that's what it's like with cancer. Cancer is a complex system existing in a complex system. And here I just found this beautiful slide of lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, attacking a cancer cell on electron microscopy. And it's rather gorgeous. This lymphocyte, this one here, appears to be putting out its hand and saying, stop, like a policeman. I couldn't believe my luck when I found that. And that's just one example of what may be happening at the microscopic level, the submicroscopic level. So, coming on to the meaning of overdiagnosis and the flaws of the hypothetical model. DCIS may regress. We don't know because we never found it. It may regress. It may stabilize, just stay there, and some of them may progress. So it's not implausible. Tony said it was implausible to think of anything other than this. It's not if you understand the mathematics of complex biological systems. And the same may apply to small invasive cancers and so on. So that is a complex system. At every stage of evolution, it can go off in different directions. And this isn't implausible because this applies to most biological systems. And you're now saying, yeah, okay, I think I understand where you're going, but what do you want to do about it? What are we supposed to do? BSc's no good, screening's no good. What are we supposed to do? My answer to that is very simple. Who says you've got to do anything? Who says you've got to do something? Yes, we want to improve cure rates for breast cancer, and I think we're doing an amazing job with modern treatments. But there's more to life than breast cancer. And my concern as a breast cancer specialist that we lose sight of other diseases that are more common amongst women at risk of breast cancer. We have to consider the totality of the woman's health, not be obsessed as single issue fanatics. Now, we fear breast cancer. Of course we fear breast cancer. I've seen it up front and ugly. But thank God, compared with other diseases, it's becoming less and less common. The commonest cause of death in women is dementia. We do nothing about that. The next commonest cause of death for women is cardiovascular disease, and then below that, cerebrovascular disease. And we just simply ignore these things and forget that our treatments and our interventions to prevent deaths of breast cancer may impact on other diseases in an adverse way. Now, you'll be glad to hear that my conclusion is the same as Tony's conclusion. We come together. And I think the answer to all this is a triage, risk assessment and risk management. We hadn't plotted this together, but I suspected we would end up the same way because we know each other very well and the way we think. And Tony's subdivisions were more complex than mine, but he's shown ways how you can assess the risk of a woman developing breast cancer. And I've just suggested a simple triage. Low risk lifestyle advice in order to avoid the common causes of death, cardiovascular disease, cerebrovascular disease, and so on. The moment we don't know how to prevent dementia. At the other extreme, with a very high risk, screening isn't the answer. Genetic testing is part of the way. So if you've got an Ashkenazi family with every other woman in that family developing breast cancer, you don't offer screening. The first thing is genetic testing. But I have little doubt that with careful selection, we can find a cohort of women who will benefit from screening. And at the same time, if we can reduce the toxicity of the treatment of breast cancer, as you will hear from Jay Vaidya later on today, then the benefits will outweigh the harms. So there is a way forward that to me is absolutely clear. But we have to change our attitudes and complacency as it is at the moment. And that is a political issue. Now, of course, just to finish, once we start reducing screening in the NHS, we don't have to worry because you can get peace of mind at the London Clinic breast cancer with personalised breast screenings, only £150, commercialised already. But what I would say, caveat emptor, beware. Thank you.